Good day. This is Ariel Torino, and today I will be discussing to you the law of supply and demand. What is the law of supply and demand? The law of supply and demand is a theory that explains the interaction between the seller of a resources and a buyer for that resources. The theory defines the relationship between the price of a given good or product and the willingness of people to either buy or sell it. Generally, as prices increases, people are willing to supply more demand and less and vice versa when the prices falls. The theory is based on two separate laws, the law of demand and the law of supply. The two laws interact to determine the actual market price and volume of goods on the market. Now, these are the key takeaways. The law of demand says that at higher prices, buyers will demand less of an economic good. The law of supply says that at higher prices, sellers will supply more of economic good. These two laws interact to determine the actual market prices and volume of goods that are traded on a market. Several independent factors can affect the shape of market supply and demand, influencing both the prices and quantities that we are observed in the market. And now we would like to try to understand the law of supply and demand. One of the most basic economic laws ties into almost all economic principles somehow. In practice, people's willingness to supply and demand a good determines that market equilibrium price or the price where the quantity of a good that people are willing to supply equals the quantity that people demand. And now let's try to look into the demand. The law of demand states that all other factors remain equal. The higher the price of a good, the fewer people will demand that good. In other words, the higher the price, the lower the quantity demanded. The amount of a good that buyer purchase at a higher price is less because at the price of a good goes up. So that's the opportunity cost of buying that good. As a result, people will naturally avoid buying a product that will force them to forego the consumption of something else they value more. And now let's talk about the supply. Like the law of demand, the law of supply demonstrates the quantity sold at a specific price. But unlike the law of demand, the supply relationship shows an upward slope. This means that the higher the price, the higher the quantity supplied. From the seller's perspective, each additional unit's opportunity cost tends to be higher and higher. Producers supply more at a higher price because the higher selling price justifies the higher opportunity cost of each additional unit sold. Now let's try to look into the supply and demand curves. At any given point in time, the supply of a good brought to market is fixed. In other words, the supply curve in this case is a vertical lane, while the demand curve is always downward sloping due to the law of diminishing marginal utility. Sellers can change no more than the market will bear based on consumers' demand at a point in time. Over longer intervals of time, however, suppliers can increase or decrease the quantities they supply to the market based on the price they expect to charge. So over time, the supply curve slope upward. The more suppliers expect to charge, the more they will be willing to produce and bring them to market. Shifts versus movement. For economics, the movements and shifts in relation to the supply and demand curves represent very different market phenomena. A movement refers to a change along a curve. On the other hand, the demand curve and movement denotes a change in both price and quantity demanded from one point to another on the curve. The movement implies that the demand relationship remains consistent. Therefore, a movement along the demand curve will occur when the price of a good change changes and the quantity demanded changes also per the original demand relationship. In other words, a movement occurs when a change in the quantity demanded is caused only by a change in price and vice versa. Like a movement along the demand curve, the supply curve means that the supply relationship remains consistent. Therefore, a movement along the supply curve will occur when the price of a good changes and the quantity supplied changes by the original supply relationship. In other words, a movement occurs when a change in quantity supplied is caused only by a change in price and vice versa. Shifts. Meanwhile, a shift in a demand or supply curve occur when a good quantity demanded or supplied changes even though the price remains the same. For instance, if the price for a bottle of beer was 100 pesos and the quantity of beer demanded increases from quantity 1 to quantity 2, there would be a shift in demand for beers. Equilibrium price, also called a market clearing price. The equilibrium price is the price at which the producer can sell all the units he wants to produce and the buyers can buy all the units he wants. With an upward sloping supply curve and a downward sloping demand curve, it is easy to visualize that the two will interact at same point. At this point, the market price is sufficient to induce suppliers to bring the market the same quantity of goods that consumers will be willing to pay for at that price. Supply and demand are balanced or in equilibrium. The exact price and amount where this depends on the shape and position of the respective supply and demand curves, each of which can be influenced by several factors. Now, let's try to look into the factors affecting supply. Supply is largely a function of production cost, including labor and materials, the physical technology available to combine inputs, the number of sellers, and their total productive capacity over the given time frame, taxes, regulations, or additional institutional cost of productions. Now, let's try to look into the factors affecting demand. Consumer preferences among different goods are the most important determinant of demand. The existence and prices of other consumer goods that are substitutes or complementary products can modify demand. Changes in condition that influence consumer preferences can also be significant, such as seasonal changes or the effects of advertising. Changing Changes in incomes can also be important in either increasing or decreasing the quantity demanded at any given price. In essence, the law of supply and demand describe a phenomenon familiar to all of us from our daily lives. It describes how else are being equal. The price of a good tends to increase when the supply of that good decreases or when the demand for that good increases. Conversely, it describes how goods will decline in price when they become more widely available or less popular among consumers. This fundamental concept plays a vital role throughout modern economics. Why is the law of supply and demand important? The law of supply and demand is essential because it helps investors, entrepreneurs, and economists understand and predict market conditions. For example, a company launching a new product might deliberately try to raise the price of its product by increasing consumers' demand through advertising. At the same time, they might try to further increase their price by deliberately restricting the numbers of units they sell to decrease supply. In this scenario, supply would be minimized while demand would be maximized, leading to a higher price. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope that you had learned something in the law of supply and demand.